All right, so in this video, we are going to continue looking at Western Europe. And in this video, we're going to turn our attention to the economic and social systems that we see throughout Western Europe. And generally speaking, the way historians talk about this dual economic social system is called feudalism. So, what I'm going to do is kind of give you a very generic, basic overview of what feudalism is. And then I'm going to try to complicate it enough that it sounds more complex. So, generally speaking, feudalism looks like this. And we've seen this triangle before. Feudalism is based on the same triangle we've used before to describe social hierarchies. And so we're going to divide this triangle, again, into four pieces. At the top of the triangle is the king. Beneath the king, we have the nobles. These are kind of people who have titles but are not the king. Dukes, counts, people like that. Beneath them, we have what we might call the minor nobility. And for our purposes, we might call these guys the knights. And then at the very bottom, we have the peasants and, I guess, other workers. Generally speaking, and again, this is all very generic and general, this is a very basic overview of how feudalism works. The king has all the land. At the top, the king owns all the territory. And he gives pieces of the land to the nobility. And the nobility, in return, give the king their loyalty. The nobles do the same thing to the minor nobles. And so they give a big piece of their land to the minor nobles in return for their loyalty. And then the minor nobles give some land to the peasants for them to work on. On the other side of the triangle, so this is in return for the land, the peasants are going to give taxes, food, and military service. So if there needs to be an army, the peasants will join the army, and they will join the army because they've been given a little piece of land to work on. So they get food, they pay their taxes, and if the need arises, they serve in the military. And that goes up the same side of the triangle. So the peasants do this for the minor nobles do it to the greater nobles, and then all of the stuff flows back up to the king. So down the triangle comes land, up the triangle goes taxes and food and military service. So if we had to define feudalism, feudalism is a reciprocal, meaning that both sides, everybody has to reciprocate something. It is a reciprocal relationship based on shared economic need, which is generally agricultural, and rigid social hierarchies. And that's pretty much what feudalism is. In return for getting land, you give this stuff. You get to eat as long as you pay your fair share. This is very, very basic. And the reason I keep saying that it's very, very basic is that this system will look different everywhere you look. So generally speaking, everyone in Western Europe follows this general idea, but the way that it plays out is going to be different. So it's going to look very different in England versus France versus a little Germany. So it's going to look very different wherever you go. How much land you give, how much in tax you have to pay, what kind of military service you have to give. It's all going to be different. So generally speaking, this is enough to kind of figure out more or less what's happening. The food is going to be different in different places. Maybe you're not giving out food. Maybe instead you're in a mining community and you can give out coal, or there's a bunch of timber and you can give back wood, or maybe you raise sheep and you can donate wool instead. The idea is that you're donating or you're giving something back up the triangle for the land. Now, it's also important to note that this system is in place because Western Europe is really poor. Western Europe is really poor, and they can't afford a centralized government because that's expensive. So really what feudalism is just local leaders doing whatever they can to keep order. So most people are never going to see anybody other than like the local noble. Maybe like this guy might show up every once in a while, but no one is ever seeing the king. This is all a very loose structure. And really everyone is just doing the best they can. That's the point of this. It's however we can maintain order, that's how we're going to maintain order. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources to figure out anything else. If giving people land in return for food is enough to keep everything working, that's what we're going to do. It's a very loose structure, it's very decentralized. As long as the king gets his money, he is happy to just let everybody do things however they want to, as long as they come when he needs military service. So, like I said, this is the economic system. This is also the social system. There is no moving between ranks. If you're a peasant, You are always going to be a peasant. You're going to marry another peasant, and you're going to have peasant children. The same thing for the minor nobility. Maybe you could become a greater noble if you play your cards right and you marry the right person. Maybe you could come up here. There's maybe a little bit of mobility between those two groups, but generally speaking, if you're here, you're here. If you're here, you're here. And if you're the king, well, that's pretty good. There's very little social mobility. The class you are born into is probably the class you're going to die in. Same thing with your kids and your grandkids. So let's talk more about what people make on the land they're given. So let's talk about economic production. What do they make? So they are limited in Western Europe in how much access they have to global, or maybe not global, but international long-distance trade. There's not a whole lot of access. And remember, we did say that their window into the world is through the Byzantines. So they can trade with the Byzantines and they can trade with other people, but the Byzantines are kind of their only entry out into the world. So they're limited in how much access they have. They're also limited in the stuff that they can produce because there's not much demand for stuff produced in Western Europe. Like, they're not really known for anything. I mean, they do produce some food, but everyone produces food. So maybe some food from Western Europe gets traded, but again, it's not like really good food. It's not anything special. It's not like that fancy rice coming from Vietnam. Another thing that might get traded is wool. Wool might be the thing that Western Europe is known for. Like if there's one thing that does get traded out of Western Europe, it might be their wool. So being a colder climate, wool is something that, other societies might find this desirable. There might be a little bit of demand for wool. But generally speaking, there's not a lot of access. There's not a lot of trading done with Western Europe. And then even if there was, there's not much stuff that the people want from Western Europe. There's some wool, maybe some other manufactured goods. But again, there's just not much demand for the stuff in Western Europe. And because there's not much money coming in here, there's also not much in the way of innovation or economic production. And because this is such an agricultural place, there aren't that many cities. all of this stuff is too agricultural to support this stuff. They're too agricultural and they're too poor. There's just not enough money coming into Western Europe to drive things like innovation or a lot of economic production. There aren't many cities because most of the people live out in the country so they can farm. So we're dealing in a situation here where they're very different from what we see in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is like almost the complete opposite of what we're seeing here. The Byzantines, very urbanized. They have a lot of economic production. They have that specialized labor. They are innovating stuff. They're interacting more with people who are coming up with interesting inventions like the compass or paper. Western Europe, they're just not interacting with those people. So there's very little innovation. Now, over time, we're going to see some interesting, we'll say eventually, we see some interesting agricultural innovations. But these take a really long time to come out. So this is like almost towards the end of time period 3. And again, these are things that other societies have already developed, and the Europeans are just kind of discovering this on their own after everybody else has already discovered it. So, for instance, we see them develop a heavy metal plow. And what this does is it lets you dig up the ground to plant seeds deeper. And you might be thinking, well, of course you have to do that. The seeds go in the ground. You have to put them deeper in the ground, and a plow digs up the land so you could do that. Europeans didn't know that, so they had to figure it out on their own. They're also going to develop things like crop rotations, like planting crops, planting different crops in the same field to produce more food. Indian farmers were doing that. Chinese farmers were doing that. Islamic farmers were doing that. The Europeans are kind of catching up. Eventually, they figure this stuff out. Same thing with fertilizer. Eventually, they realize that fertilizer will help them produce more food. But they have to figure it out on their own. And because they're so poor, this stuff comes later. If you don't have money, this stuff will come later. You'll get there eventually, but because they're so poor, it takes them longer to get to the same place. As they start to get better, as the agricultural situation improves, the economy grows, just like we would see other places. As the agricultural situation improves, the economy grows. We know this. This is how agriculture started in the first place. And we're seeing it now in Western Europe, and they're doing it kind of all on their own, isolated from the rest of these Eurasian societies. Initially, the nobility resisted this. They liked to use their land for recreation, which involved mostly like hunting. That was what most nobles liked to do for fun. But as they started to see that they could make money using their land, they started to kind of put some of their own money into these agricultural innovations. So they're like, I don't really care about hunting if I can make money. So all of this stuff was kind of done by the poor people, the people who were farming. And they just, through trial and error, figured it out. And once they start to see results, the nobility then got involved. It's like, oh, you guys are making money. I want to make money too. So the nobility initially resisted this. They resisted this urge to plant more. But as they started to see results from the innovations made by the peasants, they wanted to get involved on the money. And slowly, new crops from the East start to show up in Europe. Much later than they showed up elsewhere, but some of these new crops from the East start to show up in Europe, and they grow well in the Mediterranean, kind of in southern Europe. Not so much in the rest of Europe, but they do grow well like in Italy and in Greece. So we might see things like rice start to become more of a European thing. Slowly, it's going to slowly diffuse into Western Europe. All of this stuff, as we kind of reach the end of time period 3, all of this stuff is going to end in a pretty slow but steady increase in population. And that's simply, and we've said this before, we've seen this just about everywhere in the world, as the food increases, as we see an increase in caloric intake, we're also going to see an increase in population. And slowly, that's what we start to see. We start to see people eating more protein, more calories in general. And the more they eat, the more food that's available, the more likely it is that they're going to survive. And then very slowly, we start to see the growth, the slow growth of European cities. But let me be clear here. When we think about these European cities, if we think about a city like London or Paris, when we think about these giant cities we know from Western Europe, these have populations maybe 20,000 people. Like, that's a very large Western European city, but much smaller than anything we might consider to be a city. Like, around the same time, there are cities in China that have over 1 million people in them. So very slowly, we're starting to see people move to cities, but it's a very slow and gradual process that's not really going to take off until we get into time period 4 and then into time period 5. Right now, this is just a very slow process. And this is what we would see throughout Western Europe. So we would see this in all the little Germanys. We would see this in what will become France, in England, in Italy, in the Holy Roman Empire. This is all across Western Europe. There's one other place that I want to take a little bit of a detour to look at, and this is Italy. Italy is a bit different in that Italy doesn't survive on agriculture as much as it does on trade. And trade is going to make Italy look different than the rest of Europe. So when we talked about the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, one of the reasons that Constantinople started to decline was because Italian cities became rivals in trade. And we're kind of thinking here like maybe in the 1200s. So while Constantinople is starting to decline, these Italian cities are starting to grow. And I know we haven't really talked about it yet, but we did mention that Fourth Crusade weakened Constantinople. And one of the reasons that these crusaders weakened Constantinople is because they were from Venice, which was one of their chief Italian rivals. So these Italian cities are going to make money by trading with Islamic merchants. And I mean, we can name like the famous ones here, like the Polos from Venice are going to get really rich trading on the Silk Road. And they're also going to kind of write about their travels too. But this is going to set up the Italians to lead Europe. So Italians are going to lead Europe into time period 4 when we get there eventually, because this is where all the money is. And so this is where we're going to get like the Renaissance from. So if we think about what all of this is, to just summarize this all real quickly, most of Western Europe is extremely poor. And they basically just do whatever they can to get by. Eventually, the agricultural situation is going to improve. They're going to start to make some more money. And slowly, very slowly, the population of Western Europe is going to increase because they're going to figure out new ways of making more food. It's still a very agricultural economy. It's based on growing things and making food. Italy is an outlier. They're still going to be making they're still going to be making food, but they're going to be making money through trade, and they're going to start to replace the Byzantines as Europe's window into the rest of the world. So we're going to stop there. In the next video, we're going to put another layer onto Western European society by talking about the church. So on top of all of this stuff, now we also have to figure in where the Catholic Church falls into it. And that will be the subject of the next video. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.